very essential, and that's why Laurent was talking about this app, which is now available, and Luciano will also provide some other tools. And then it happens that in the middle of this symposium, we have something about stress and strain, which sounds a little bit complex and eventually esoteric. But that's my intention today, to try to explain in simple words what it means, but maybe more importantly, how we can already, of course, with a couple of question marks, but how we can eventually already use this kind of concept at the bedside to try to protect the lung during mechanical ventilations. So let's start simple by explaining what is the stress first. Stress is something which is okay for us, I would say, because it's about pressure. It's a force applied by on a surface. Well, there is different kind of stress, of course, and we can make it quite complex. There is the compressions, which is a pressure applied on an object that will reduce the size or shorten that object. There is a tension stress. There is normal stress, which is perpendicular to the surface on which the pressure is applied. There is shear stress, hydrostatic. That's the stress we have when we are doing some scuba diving, for instance. Directed stress, etc. But in short and in very simple, it's more or less the pressure we are applying on an object. The strain is already something a little bit more complex, because we are not very used to talk about the strain. But the strain is basically how that object is changing depending on the pressure we are applying on that object. So again, it's more about deformations, change in the size, change in volume. And it can be also, of course, really complex, because there is different kind of strain, linear strain, compressions, tensions, shear stress, etc., etc. But in short, and applying to mechanical ventilations, it's how much we are going to change the volume of the lung compared to its initial size or volume. What is maybe more important, I believe, is to understand the relationship between the stress and the strain, and that's basically in terms of physics how we are describing the objects. There is different kind of stress-strain relationship, like the brittle one, which is what's happened if you are applying a pressure on the glass. It keeps the size and the shape of the glass until a certain stress where it breaks. We have different kind of relationship for the metals, for the plastic, and we also have a stress-strain relationship which is specific for viscous object, elastic, and viscoelastic objects. And here, if we are starting to talk about viscoelasticity, suddenly we are back to something related to the lung, right? You heard probably about viscoelasticity. And basically, if we are analyzing physically what means a viscoelastic stress and strain relationship, that's something which is somehow relatively close to what we know in the lung. The time is spending a role. Because with this kind of object or relationship, the time to relax from a given positions, the stress relaxations, is needed. You need time for that. You need time also to change the shape of such a subject. And when you release the pressure, the stress on that subject, you need also a little bit of time to restore the original size and shape of this object. And also something which is also quite well known during mechanical ventilations and in respiratory physiology, which is the hysteresis. Here you have the physical representations of that with the stress and the strain, and if you are already thinking about the pressure as related to the stress and volume related to the strain, you already have here a pressure-volume relationship. in the wrong, or let's say unusual way to show that, because usually we are showing on the x-axis the pressure and on the y-axis the volume. Here is the opposite, but that's exactly the same. And you can see also that we have what we call the hysteresis, meaning that there is an energy dissipation in that object when the behavior of that object is viscoelasticity. So I told you that I will try to make it simple, and more importantly, that we will try to see what's possible to do with that at the bedside. So the first questions from the room now might be, yeah, well, nice, and so what, right? Maybe the first answers might be to say, well, it's a way to understand a little bit better what's happened during mechanical ventilation at the alveoli level, for instance. And this is just a recent nice study evaluating if you apply the same level of stress on a different model of alveoli, how the strain is generated on that alveoli. And clearly there is a difference if we are using a very spherical theoretical models or something which is closer to the reality, right? And the red part is the strain as it is measured in this study, and you can see very rapidly and obviously that the deformations of the alveoli is not going to happen exactly the same if we are starting from something very theoretical or something which is closer to the reality. It can help also to know, for instance, when we try to see what's happened at the alveoli level, at the very superficial part of the lung, when you apply a micro camera, for instance, what's happened on the alveoli. And with this study, for instance, they realized that just by applying the camera on the alveoli level, we are already generating some kind of stress and strain. And that's very obvious in this kind of study. So maybe it may help to understand at the alveoli level a little bit better what we are doing during mechanical ventilations. But at the end of the day, you will tell me again, yeah, nice study, nice colors, but so what? The first answer to that, I believe, comes from the couple of studies being published years ago, and maybe it's to raise our attentions that, and this has been said and shown very clearly by Luciano Gattinoni and his team, that if we try today to adjust the ventilator with the tidal volume and the pressure, the airway pressure, well, you will tell me that we don't have any other choice, but anyway, maybe we are quite far to know what we are doing at the alveoli level in terms of stress and strain. And that's maybe why, basically, all the studies about low tidal volume, for instance, some of them are positive, showing that yes, definitely, no doubt, no questions, we have to ventilate the patients with a lower tidal volume. But if you are including the 4 largest randomized controlled trial with the outcome investigated at the end of the follow-up, basically all these studies together, you know, they are not showing something very significant. That's also why, for instance, if we are measuring the transpulmonary pressure from the proximal airway pressure, even by using the plateau pressure, we are very far from what's happened at the transpulmonary level. And that's the study from David Cumelo showing very clearly that if for a given plateau pressure, you may have a huge range of transpulmonary pressure. This may explain also why, for instance, the different publications and study done by Danny Stalmo showing that if you applied a certain level of PEEP at the proximal level, the end expiratory transpulmonary pressure might be very, very different and much lower. And sometimes we believe that we are applying a certain level of PEEP to keep the lung open, for instance, but if we are measuring really what's happened at the alveoli level, well, there is no positive pressure at all during end expirations. So maybe the most important point regarding stress and strain is to say, take care, maybe tidal volume, just tidal volume, it's not enough. You have to consider eventually the change of the volume from the FRC, the relaxing volume. And also you have to think about more the transpulmonary pressure instead of the plateau pressure. One step further, but here we start to have some kind of question mark, is about stress and strain to reflect the outcome, or to get some information about the severity of our patient. And it comes from also some studies from the group of Luciano Gattinoni, clearly showing, and this is from the study mentioned before by Laurent, that in patients with the most recruitable lung, in which we have during inspirations the opening of the alveoli, and during expirations the closing of the alveoli, these patients with large recruitability are basically the patients that had in that study the poorest outcome. And that's also in this second study, they also calculate the strain in that volume, and they found that at least in the most severe patients, the one with a huge amount of the lung being recruitable, the strain was the highest. So it can give some information if we are using the strain compared to just the tidal volume, some additional information in terms of outcome. This can be used eventually, also some question mark here, to help setting the ventilator. And that's a smaller computational study we've done with Joseph Brunner a couple of years ago, trying to find out what might be the optimal tidal volume and rate to minimize the stress and the strain. In this study, we used what we call the stress and strain index, which is basically the product of the stress and the strain, and the lowest the stress and the strain, and the better it is, right? And first, we were able to find that, of course, if the lung volume are reduced, here is the end expiratory lung volume, the stress and the strain induced by mechanical ventilation for a given tidal volume and a given rate is much higher. But we were also able to identify a tidal volume which minimized, in all the cases, the stress and the strain, which was basically 2 times the physiological dead space. So in short, it means this is just computation. So again, a lot of question mark, we need some clinical validations. But somehow, if we are able to ventilate our patients with 2 times the dead space, probably we are in positions to minimize the stress and the strain. And we find also a rate, an optimal rate that minimizes the stress and the strain, which is for a given minute ventilations depending on the dead space, right? So if we are taking it in consideration, if we are able to measure the dead space, the physiological dead space, we might be able to adjust a little bit better the tidal volume to minimize the stress and the strain. Well, maybe a little bit more simple, maybe also more question mark, most probably. The stress and strain relationship is defined by the specific elastance of the lung. That's something specific to the lung. And it has been found so far that this value, the specific elastance, is more or less the same across different patients, different disease. And if we are replacing now the stress by the transpulmonary pressure and the strain by the ratio between the tidal volume and the FRC, you have this relationship with the transpulmonary pressure being equal to the specific elastance times the ratio between the tidal volume and the FRC. And based on the study published by Chiumelo, it seems that somehow in our patients, the specific elastance is between 12 to 16, something relatively constant. And I use 15 here just to make the demonstrations because it's easier. So now, if you know what you are given in terms of tidal volume for your patients, for instance, 500 milliliters, and you are able to measure the FRC, you can really easily, by applying this concept and these equations, make some kind of reasonable assumptions about the transpulmonary pressure. What does that mean? It means that you don't need an esophageal catheter to get access to the transpulmonary pressure. Again, it's an estimation. It needs probably some kind of clinical validations, but at least the rationale sounds good. It can help also to titrate the tidal volume according to the FRC. Same equations, nothing changed. We have the same specific elastance, let's say 15, and we don't want to have more than For instance, this can be discussed, but 5 centimeters of water as transpulmonary pressure at the end of inspirations. We can discuss this point, but again, to make the demonstrations, it's easier to use 5. And then you see that the tidal volume that will keep the strain and the stress minimal will be 1/3 of the FRC. Right. So if you are able to measure the FRC based on this and in some assumptions regarding the specific elastance, you can get some information or some estimations on how to set the tidal volume. There is even some publications suggesting that it can help to estimate how much with PEEP we are increasing the FRC, even without measuring FRC. Here we have to take into the pictures, the story that we have a dynamic strain, which is the one related to the tidal volume, and also what we call the static strain, which is the additional volume generated by PEEP. And in doing so, for instance, in that paper, they make some assumptions again regarding the specific elastance, also the ratio between the lung elastance compared to the total elastance of the respiratory system. And here we can discuss a little bit. But basically, with this kind of assumption, they were able to predict quite relatively well the increase in FRC generated by a certain increase in PEEP. Question mark again, a lot of question marks, but again, if we want to summarize a little bit, definitely it helps to move a little bit further and not thinking anymore about pressure and tidal volume, more about, again, transpulmonary pressure and the change in the volume we are generated according to the relaxing volume, the FRC. Maybe that gives some indications about the outcome of our patients. And again, back to this study published by Luciano Gattinoni, the higher the strain, the more we are increasing the volume of the lung above the FRC, and the more dangerous it is. Maybe it can help to set the tidal volume and the rate on our ventilator, again, to minimize the stress and the strain. Maybe it helps to get some estimations, again, some estimations about the transpulmonary pressure, if we are able to make some assumptions and if we are able to measure the FRC. Maybe it can help also to measure how much we are increasing the lung volume with PEEP. So a lot of question mark, and of course there is some kind of limitations about this. First, we have to keep in mind that we are still at the very proximal level, so quite far from the alveoli. So what we are measuring, it's a global stress, a global strain, and that would be great to be a little bit closer to the alveoli. It's somehow, you've seen from the beginning that stress might be not only a normal stress, it might be much more complex. We have different strains playing at the same time in the lung during mechanical ventilations. And again, we've seen that the strain is clearly depending on how is the shape of the alveoli and where that stress is applying at the alveoli level. Something I realized, but that may be something we will have time to discuss. I was searching quite deeply on finding some more information about the specific elastance in our patients, and honestly, there are very few publications on that. So why not making these assumptions that this specific elastance is constant across different diseases in our patients, but honestly, I believe we need some kind of additional information on that. And basically, on the right side, I've done a simple computations on how much mistake we are going to generate if we are wrongly estimating the specific elastance. The good point on that is that the lower the FRC and the lower the tidal volume, the less this specific elastance is impacting in the equations in that story. So somehow, the more severe are the patients and the lower the tidal volume, the less it is important to know precisely the specific elastance. And finally, it seems, and that's against this constant specific elastance, it seems that basically not only the stress and the strain relationship is important, but also the rate at which we applied and we generate stress and strain. So the rate is also something important. And it seems, at least from a physical point of view, that the stress and strain relationship is changing depending on the rate we are applying the stress on this object, which means that basically the elastance, the specific elastance, may change also depending on the rate at which we are applying this stress. So I believe that's my last slides regarding the stress and the strain. Well, I believe it helps definitely to think a little bit different about what we are doing during mechanical ventilations. Again, not just focusing on the tidal volume and on the plateau pressure. Start thinking a little bit further. It might be some concrete applications, but definitely we are missing a lot of clinical validations on this topic. It's probably too preliminary to be confident about this. And yes, well, we need these clinical validations, definitely. Thank you very much.